is to talk to one another and to engage in discussions with each other. And while we will have a number of formal presentations, our overall hope is for a climate primarily of listening and not just one of making our own points. So with that in mind, let me just note that our topic this morning is protection of international freedom of religion or belief and human dignity by national and international institutions. Judge Ann Power Ford touched on some of the opportunities for and challenges to protecting human dignity and freedom of religion and belief in her stirring speech last night. And I think you'll join me in sensing that we got off to a really remarkable start with her address. Today we'd like to explore those themes in greater detail. Let me begin by introducing the entire panel. First we have to my immediate left, to your right, Simona Cuchini, Political Affairs Director, United Nations Office on Genocide Prevention and the Responsibility to Protect. Simona comes from a deep background within the United Nations. She has served in field operations in Burundi, with the UN peacekeeping operations, and as an electoral and civil affairs officer. Also in the Sudan, where she worked as a civil affairs officer. Her focus has been on supporting human security, democratization, and human rights in conflict and post-conflict situations. Next is Jan Figel, EU Special Envoy for the Promotion of Freedom of Religion or Belief outside the European Union. He was named in 2016 as the first special envoy for freedom of religion and belief. So he's been inventing this office. Previously, he served on the EU Commission as European Commissioner for Education, Training and Culture. He also served as the State Secretary for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Chief Negotiator for Slovakia's accession into the European Union. Juliana Natale is the Director of the Office of Human Rights, Freedom and Inclusion. This office within the Office of Human Rights, Freedoms and Inclusions at Global Affairs Canada. That's the Canadian Foreign Affairs Ministry. There she helps develop and implement Canada's international policies and advocacy efforts related to freedom of belief, as well as promotion of pluralism, respect for diversity, and inclusion. She has also served as Chief of Staff to the Foreign and Defence Policy Advisor to the Prime Minister within the Privy Council Office of Canada. Next is Ambassador Michel, recently appointed Special Representative for Religious Freedom or Belief in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Denmark. So he joins Ambassador Brownback, who we'll hear from later today, and Jan Figel in the growing cadre of foreign affairs officials specifically devoted to freedom of religion and belief. He also serves as ambassador for Denmark in Portugal, head of Department for the European Neighbourhood Policy. And he has previously served as head of Department for the European Policy in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Deputy Chief of Mission of the Embassy of Denmark in Paris. Finally, one of our oldest and closest friends, President Michael Young, President of Texas A&M University and former chair of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. President Young may hold the record for the person who attended the most symposiums consecutively, because he attended for 15 years before he began his career as university president. But I'm afraid to say that with the passage of time, Judge Cliff Wallace has probably taken that hat from you, Michael. So you've been surpassed, but by a very good man. He has been involved in freedom of religion and belief for a very long time. He's been a visiting scholar at 3 universities in Japan. He clerked for the U.S. Supreme Court and served in government positions such as Ambassador for Trade and Environmental Affairs, although not under the current administration, member of the Council of Foreign Relations. He's also worked on treaties relating to German reunification, the North American Free Trade Agreement, and the Uruguay round of World Trade Organization negotiations. He also served for 8 years on the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, where he chaired that commission on 2 separate occasions. Could I ask you to join me in welcoming our panel? All right. Well, to start, we would like to ask each of you to tell us a little bit about your organization or position and what you see as the strengths and resources it brings to the table on freedom of religion or belief and human dignity issues. So, Simona, let me begin with you. And for this first question, let's move right down the line. After this, we won't ask everyone to respond to every question, but my hope is to really run a rather informal conversation.
Yes, thank you very much. I come from the Office on Genocide Prevention and the Responsibility to Protect, which is a small office within the Department of Political Affairs. My office...
Can you use this microphone?
She's mic'd up. Can you maybe move it up just a smidge?
Yeah.
Up your shirt.
Hola. Better?
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
So now it's better. I was saying that I'm currently serving in the Office of Genocide Prevention and the Responsibility to Protect in the Department of Political Affairs of the United Nations. So we have an independent mandate, and we are led by Mr. Adama Dieng, the Special Advisor on the Prevention of Genocide. The office was created in 2004 by Mr. Kofi Annan, the previous late Secretary General of the United Nations. And Mr. Annan established this office with a letter to the Security Council because of primarily the genocide that happened in Rwanda in 1994 and in Bosnia in 1993. So Mr. Annan was really committed to the never again and to make sure that by establishing an office that would deal directly with the prevention of genocide within the United Nations, what happened during the 90s in Rwanda and in Bosnia would never happen again. And in fact, my office is mandated to provide early warnings to the Secretary General and through the Secretary General to the Security Council. So we report to the Security Council on situations that could lead to genocide. Now, in 2010, the mandate of the office was extended also to monitor situations of war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity. So we have now a much broader mandate that allow us to look at situations where there are serious violations of human rights that could lead to the worst crimes ever, including genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and ethnic cleansing. So, how does this relate to the protection of freedom of religion and in general human dignity? So these are crimes that have been defined as the most heinous crimes in the history of humanity. When these crimes happen, thousands of people die. Thousands of people die in the worst situation ever. There are entailed in these crimes the worst violation of human rights. There are killings, murders, torture, rapes. Women are killed with their babies. So at the basis of the mandate of the Special Advisor on the Prevention of Genocide is really the protection of the human dignity, of the human life, as the primary element of the international human rights standards. So we are directly connected to the International Declaration of Human Rights, but not only, we are mandated to prevent these crimes by the Genocide Convention that was established, that was signed actually one day before of the International Declaration of Human Rights, that makes us see how the prevention of genocide is really the basis on which all other international human rights conventions are rooted. We believe that the defense and protection and advocacy of international human rights standards is at the basis of the protection of human dignity. And this links the Genocide Convention to Article 18, in particular of the ICCPR, the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights, that refers to the protection of freedom of religion and belief. So without freedom of religion and belief, there is not wider protection of international human rights standards, and without this protection, there is not wider protection of human dignity. So we consider freedom of religion and belief, and along other freedoms and rights, at the basis of the protection of human dignity, and as a way of leaving no one behind.
Thank you very much. Jan, would you like to tell us a little bit about the EU office and your work?
Yeah. Thank you, Brett, and thank you all for this nice community, which is regularly coming here, but also renewing or enlarging, and it's good to work in this spirit of togetherness. Yes, I'm first ever EU Special Envoy, and I hope that it will be second and then some sort of tradition or history, but what is more important is that we started to deal with freedom of religion or belief more systematically in the European Union, which is fruit of reconciliation or awareness of importance of human rights, justice for all, human dignity of all. And it's real. It's 60 years old organization, 28 members, the largest economic and trade bloc in the world. But only after so many decades, now we come to the point which is historically very, very special, very important, but also today, again and again. In a way, I represent the fruit of something what we need in other parts of the world: reconciliation, rule of law, policies, relations based on common good. 5 years ago, 2013, 28 diplomacies and European diplomacy adopted guidelines, kind of principles in a set for our foreign or external policy. 2014, after last European elections, there was first intergroup on faith and religious tolerance established, first ever. And there are elections of European Parliament or parliamentarians directly organized since 1979. But only now there is the concrete group. 2015, under the initiative of Canada, we've started to cooperate, and Europe is there and quite active on international contact group to deal with issues around freedom of religion together with like-minded friends, partners, and that's also a contribution and the way to go ahead. Yes, and 2016 I was invited to be first ever EU Special Envoy for freedom of religion or belief outside of the Union. It doesn't mean dichotomy, it doesn't mean double face, but inside we have many important instruments, starting with, of course, constitutions and mechanisms within 28 democracies, but also common European jurisdiction of the Strasbourg Court based on European Convention on Human Rights and Article 9 on particularly here it was discussed or reflected yesterday. I was invited especially because of the atrocities, mass atrocities in Iraq and Syria committed by ISIS fighters in the Middle East. So I would say this is not so much fruit of just political decisions, but real martyrdom, suffering of thousands in horrible scenarios or situations you may know. Yeah, and since those years we have included a much more freedom of religion or belief agenda into human rights dialogues with partner countries, which we have on a country base, bilaterally or in some cases multilaterally. We have started training of diplomats to be religiously more literate, to know what is going on, to understand differences, because if they are illiterate, they cannot help. They even can, damage or bring problem in the situations. We have a special instrument, which is political and financial, called European Instrument for Democracy and Human Rights, with 1.4 billion euros, where these issues, human rights and religious freedom, are tackled. For the next 7 years, starting after 2020, we propose increase of this money, 15%. At least that's the current proposal. We have started also new inter-religious and intercultural projects with developing countries, which is a novelty. It was not so visible or present. And now I think it becomes part of the quest for solutions, for reconciliation, for peace in difficult territories. We all know that without engagement and contribution of faith-based organizations and religious leaders, we cannot achieve Sustainable Development Goals 2030. So there are nice, proclamations, objectives, very important for the world as such, but also for individual countries and particular regions of the world, Africa, Asia, ACP countries. But without FBOs, faith-based organization, we cannot make. And that's something very important, not only to mention, but to deal with. And when I meet religious leaders, and I do meet them last time in Lebanon 2 weeks ago, I am preparing for Burkina Faso, for Malaysia, Indonesia, Egypt in November, I always dwell on religious responsibility, because freedom itself, freedom without responsibility will not work, will not exist even. It will cease or die out. And last not least, this position, yes, is now seen in broader variety or group of similar representatives, and I'm glad that just since this year, in January in Denmark, then in May in Germany, and now in July in United Kingdom, the new positions have been created under the title Special Representative or Special Envoy, Commissioner for this agenda. So member states, in European Union terms, are joining this line, and we need to coordinate, to cooperate for the sake of those who suffer, not so much for our own cooperation itself, but I'm glad that individual countries follow the similar path, that this policy is needed. It's something special, but it cannot be isolated or only technical, administrative. It must be duly incorporated into the systems on national and international levels. And last not least to mention, because it's a lot already, European Parliament, which is a big parliament and influential in a way, started recently in September. They started debate on my mandate and the guidelines on religious freedom, and the intention and the draft proposal is to institutionalize this role. So it cannot be just, driven by annual renewed mandate or very limited conditions, but it should be stronger and better equipped. And I think that's a victory over the questions or testing observations. We need that. Europe is, as I say, fruit of reconciliation after nightmares, after major tragedies and divisions. And now we should share what we learned, what we have, because we can give only what we have. Nemo dat kon non habet. And that's also my role here. I'm glad to be here for the third time. I think this is great opportunity, and I thank you for your engagements, for your contributions.
Juliana.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. I think I'd like to start off by echoing the words of Mr. Figel in saying what a pleasure it is to be here with you this morning. And I also would like to thank BYU for organizing the symposium for now 25 years. And I've heard so much about the conversations that happen and the coalitions that develop through these symposiums. And this is something that really resonates in terms of the work that Canada is trying to do internationally. So thank you very much. And thank you for inviting us to be a part of the semi-annual general conference yesterday. It was a marvel to listen to the choir. It was both emotional and meaningful. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you.
And thank you very much for the opportunity to share with you a little bit about the structure of the Office of Human Rights, Freedoms and Inclusion within Canada, and within specifically the Department of Foreign Affairs. Now, this office was established in May of 2016, and really it was established with a view to build on and broaden the impact of the former Office of Religious Freedom, which at the time had its own standalone ambassador.
I'm getting an indication that a few people in the back aren't hearing you very well. Maybe you can speak just a little louder. Maybe we can get an adjustment, or maybe you can move it up your lapel just a smidge.
Is that better? Good? Okay. Could
you start over with the praise of BYU?
I think it's being recorded, so you're good.
It's on YouTube.
I'm sorry.
That's good. The Office of Human Rights, Freedoms and Inclusion is really born out of a core belief that the Government of Canada holds on the interconnected, interrelated, universal nature of human rights. And for the first time with the establishment of the office, the Department of Global Affairs, or the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Canada, decided to bring together the full family of divisions and units within the department that are working on human rights, to allow us to build off of each other's work and to leverage each other's work. The office itself is comprised of, when it was established, was comprised of 3 sister divisions. A division that is focused on advancing human rights writ large and with a special focus on Indigenous affairs and Indigenous rights internationally. A second division on advancing the principles of democracy, with a focus on also exploring the impact of social media and social media platforms on human rights. And then my division, or the division on inclusion and religious freedom, which was assigned with a special role as serving as the focal point for faith and belief communities in Canada and internationally. And what does this all mean? So the role that I hold and that my team undertakes is really to ensure that there is a space for dialogue for Canada's faith and belief community, which is active internationally in promoting and advancing freedom of religion or belief. And we thought that this was a very important piece because quite often Canada's and faith and belief communities around the world also hold a very strong network internationally and are very much aware of the threats and the difficult situations of faith and belief communities that faith and belief communities are facing around the world. With this, we established a roundtable with faith and belief communities, allowing us to both learn from and share with them the different activities that the Government of Canada was undertaking on faith and freedom of religion or belief, but also the activities that they themselves were undertaking. We also wanted to ensure that there was an open and transparent development of policy, Canadian policy making, and that when Canada was speaking internationally about freedom of religion or belief, we were speaking as representatives of Canada's diversity, of Canada's faith and belief platform. We also, like Mr. Figel mentioned, seized on the importance of ensuring that our foreign service officers and our representatives of Canadian foreign policy abroad were increasing their literacy, their religious literacy. And so we put in place within the department a religious literacy series, which allows us to bring in faith and belief communities from across Canada to share with our foreign service officers the reality of faith and belief traditions within Canada and around the world. And we've held a number of such literacy series ranging from understanding Islam to understanding humanism and atheism, to indigenous spirituality, and most recently, discussion on the changing face of Christianity. So that's a little bit what we've done domestically to learn from and gain a better understanding of faith and belief traditions and the specific right of freedom of religion or belief, which then allows us to bring this forward at the international level. And internationally, as Mr. Figel, you've done my job for me, has mentioned, Canada established in 2015 the International Contact Group on Freedom of Religion or Belief, which brings together almost 30 countries that are dedicated to advancing freedom of religion or belief internationally. And we currently co-chair this group with the United States. The work that we've done on freedom of religion or belief internationally is very much inspired by a core belief of respect for diversity and inclusion. And so the other part of my mandate, or of the mandate of the office that I serve, as you've noted, is the word inclusion. And this is really based on the government's fundamental belief that in Canada, diversity is a strength. And with this, we have been discussing and speaking to Canadians across Canada on how they understand and how they live their diversity and their inclusion, with in an effort to get a better understanding and to be able to better represent Canada's diversity internationally. So I think I'll stop there because I want to give space to everybody else, but I welcome any questions that you might have on the work that we do.
Thank you. Michael?
Thank you so much, and good morning to everyone. It's a fantastic honor to be here on a panel, just 30 days into my position, pretending to be an expert on these matters which you probably have been working on for years and years. I was highly recommended to come here by a fellow Dane who was here last year. And she said, you know, if you're going to get a quick crash course, post-vocational training course into these matters, you've got to go to Utah to be you. And so I'm honored for the invitation, and it's a great pleasure. I hope that by a few comments. I might be able to contribute a little bit, but bear over with my limited knowledge. I'm a career diplomat. So that means, you know, I can talk a lot without saying anything. And it also means that you know, I'm a special representative. It was an appointment made by the foreign minister this year as a new initiative. The position was so lucky to have another one in the beginning, and then I came on 30 days ago. I'm serving two ministers in the Foreign Office. We have two ministers, one the Foreign Minister and the other one the Development Minister. And that is also reflected in the jobs which have been determined or defined for the function. Because on one hand, it reaches out for some of the general questions, the global issue of the place of religion in foreign policy and FORB. Hopefully we might be able to help yarn out in getting this agenda going in the European Union, so that eventually a European policy can be made on these issues, and we can have a more horizontal debate about that. But we'll see to that next year, hopefully. So one of these issues I try to follow is that this general question of mobilization. Of course, being a member of your contract group, there is still the issue that many European countries still do not have a special representative. And so hopefully we might not discourage them for making one by appointing people like me, but we will be able to help them get the idea that it might be a good one. And so we can add to this notion of mobilization, but mobilization in our sense is wider, because we would also like to see that hopefully this issue might be treated not only by the specific NGOs in the field, and we have some in Denmark as well, but that also the broader international human rights organizations might be involved. I've learned in the 30 days that FORB has not always been so highly regarded as a right, perhaps as other rights, at least among certain horizontally based organizations. And so there's a work to be done there, getting some of these organizations more strongly involved in handling the issue. And moreover, the questions which is especially crucial for my development minister is this link between FORB and women's rights. And that also gives a possibility perhaps to reach out to some of the women rights groups and get them involved in FORB due to the obvious connection between the violation of FORB, which is touch for women and hurting women. So enough about that aspect perhaps on mobilization. And the second angle on my job will be to deal with some bilateral projects. 4 countries in which we have embassies which are working robustly and are manned with enough personnel to deal with these kind of questions, have been chosen where we'll be starting work on 4 projects. And those are partnering up with Egypt, Lebanon, Iran, and Indonesia. And hopefully if the government gets her will in the financial negotiations, they will also provide me with some additional money so I can finance the projects. But normally it works rather well. So I'm optimistic, and we've started to work with the NGO community in Denmark and with others to see what kind of ideas are out there to be developed within these 4 countries. And then thirdly, there is more broadly approach or focus on the Middle East region at large, regional projects, which we hope to sponsor some religious dialogue projects and so forth. And we got a pot of money to develop that. I think the next one will be in Amman in the end of October. So there will be some more regionally oriented projects to be developed. Fourthly, the normative approach. It goes without saying, you know much better, many of you, than I, what that is about. Perhaps I could just add to that some of our particular focus will be on the link between the freedom of religion or belief and responsibility to protect or women and women's rights. So we can perhaps do a little bit of additional work and help the processing in the normative track. United Nations working on that. Finally, we decided to try to take upon a few individual cases, but it goes without saying that of prosecuted individuals. It goes without saying that we will not be talking a lot about that, since publicity is contrary to the result. So that will be more or less sort of the general 5 tracks of the work which I will be trying to work on with the respective departments in the Foreign Office. In our Foreign Office, we deal with not only foreign policy per se, but also development aid and also the other questions. So it's a unified organization. So obviously it goes without saying that when it comes to projects, it will be collaboration with our DANIDA, as it's called, the development aid or people or divisions. And when it comes to the UN, it will be with the UN people, and foreign policy will be with the security and foreign policy directors. So it will be a variety of cooperation within, and that will be, of course, diplomacy in itself. But I'm quite positive by the first 30 days. The agenda is really something picking up, and I must say that the way that the function has been received in Denmark by the NGO community has been very favorable, and so I'm still, after 30 days, extremely positive about the possibility to hopefully help to do a little bit of a difference in this field. But thank you so much. I look forward to the questions.
Thanks, Michael. Michael, too.
Brett, thank you. It's been 4 years since I've started a presentation without saying howdy, which is, of course, the traditional Texas greeting. But I think I can resist. I left my boots home, so I think I can resist the temptation to do it. But I want to echo my co-panelists' compliments to Cole, to Brett, to Elizabeth, to all of you who have for 25 years now put this conference together. I've had the privilege of seeing the growth of it, not just numerically, but in terms of its influence and its power. Cole, and you ought to know what a tremendous contribution this has been to the world. And I just am honored to be here again with this conference, because I know what a difference this makes. I'll speak briefly. I know you didn't. You said my current institution, and I can tell you at great length about Texas A&M University, but I think that's not why I'm actually here. So let me talk a little bit about the Commission on International Religious Freedom, which I had the privilege of working to set up and serve on for a number of years. That was a product of the International Religious Freedom Act of 1998. Which also created the ambassadorial position that you'll be hearing from this afternoon from Ambassador Brownback. The purpose of it really was to encourage the U.S. government on the executive side to weave issues of freedom of thought, conscience, and belief more robustly into our foreign policy. And it was premised on 2, I think, relatively simple but not always commonly shared ideas. One was a profound moral dimension to it, which is this is the right thing to do, that what people believe, particularly that comes out of their faith-based beliefs, really in many ways is among the most powerful thing that informs and defines their life, and what it means to be human, how you teach your children, how you behave and interact with others. Encouraging that has a powerful, very powerful moral dimension to it. But in addition, it has a really important teleological dimension to it, too. It's a very practical dimension from the U.S. perspective, in that countries that give robust space to that human right tend to be the kind of partners that are much easier to partner with for the United States in terms of advancing whatever our collective global agenda is with respect to creating peace and stability, economic development around the world. And so encouraging countries to adopt that really has a very powerful dimension for U.S. foreign policy and for the kinds of world that we'd like to see and to operate in. And that was the premise of the creation. It created the ambassadorial position. That act created the ambassadorial position. It created It created a requirement that the State Department produce reports on an annual basis regarding not only human rights, which they already had an obligation to do, but also freedom of religion around the globe, which had a powerful, maybe slightly unintended consequence of also making sure that every embassy around the United States, or around the world, every U.S. embassy had an official in it that was looking at issues of freedom of religion and thought, conscience, and belief. And so it connected them with a certain part of civil society that had not always been at the forefront of the mind of our embassies and our consulates around the world. And then thirdly, it created the Commission. The Commission's obligation was, as nearly as I could discern, and certainly as we acted, was essentially to nag the State Department and to nag the President to really think more systematically and coherently about the role that this principle ought to play in the development of our foreign policy. So we produced an annual report. The annual report was really not designed initially to simply replicate the State Department's report, but was designed to help identify countries where there ought to be particular focus on the part of the United States in advancing that agenda. And then, importantly, and I don't know that the Commission has fully fulfilled its role as I think we all hoped, but to also identify tools that the U.S. government might have to advance that agenda. It's one thing to encourage them to do it. It's another to suggest how it might be done consistent with all the other interests and needs that the United States has. And in that regard, I will just tell you, after significant experience with it, 2 or 3 things that emerged out of it, some of which surprised me a little bit, some of which weren't such surprises. One of the big surprises to me was that while the Commission did not have enormous tools at its behest, the very act of identifying this issue, highlighting it, putting sunlight on it, seemed powerful and seemed relevant in ways that I think I had not fully appreciated. And that is, I think, a lesson for all of us who work in the international sphere. And I'm really heartened to hear of all the countries and the international organizations that focus on this now, because the profundity of the moral dimension of this issue really does give the very fact of publicity a powerful tool in terms of advancing that interest. Now, we also looked for other kinds of tools to recommend to the government, and in some cases slightly controversial tools, but even the threat of those turned out to be powerful in a variety of occasions. The second one, relating to the first, that surprised me is that the law did permit the U.S., in fact, required the U.S. government to identify certain countries that were considered countries of particular concern, where this was a right that was particularly ferociously repressed. And then consequences were to follow. U.S. foreign policy consequences were to follow. I don't think, while countries were occasionally named, they were almost always countries that were also on the terrorist list, so there weren't really additional policy implications to that in most cases. But the Commission went a step further and also added in countries of concern that hadn't quite risen to that level of extraordinary concern, but were on sort of a trajectory that seemed problematic. I was surprised how concerned countries were about that and how much they wanted to stay off those lists. And I thought, you know, I've with absolutely no power other than that of the pen, the Commission actually turned out to have a little bit of authority and to accomplish things. And then, as I say, a great deal of our work, which was variously successful, was to help the State Department and the executive branch identify additional tools in the foreign policy arsenal that they might use to advance these kinds of interests. The most important contribution I think we ultimately made in some measure was helping the U.S. government understand that there is not only a moral dimension to this right, but there is a very practical dimension, and that's increasingly apparent. Its relationship to economic development. Now again, correlation and causation are not quite the same thing, but the correlations are very high between economic development, environmental protection, empowerment across a whole range of different variables. All of these seem to have a high correlation with the capacity to advance this. We were very clear, by the way, just sort of in conclusion, that the purpose of the Commission was analysis and recommendations in regard to the universally accepted human rights, not the idiosyncratic American First Amendment, however much enthusiasm we may personally have for that. What we really look to were the UN and the other international human rights documents, and so particularly defined our work with respect to thought, conscience, and belief, not just freedom of religion, but thought, conscience, and belief. We used to describe ourselves as freedom of religion, freedom from religion, freedom for religion, and wanted to ensure that was a central part of what we thought about with respect to the Commission's work. And I think a Commission made possible, as I think many of these positions are, in part by the work that I think has occurred over the years. The UN Human Rights Declaration, I think, was a very powerful instrument, to be sure. But I think in many ways among the greater breakthroughs was really the human rights activities of the CSCE, the Conference on Security and Cooperation, which now actually has a noun attached to it. I think it's the Organization of Cooperation in Security in Europe, because it was probably the first organization that really brought a group of countries across a fairly broad political spectrum that essentially legitimized the opportunity for one country to look into the behavior of another country with respect to how that country treated its own citizens. In the past, it was generally a legitimate response that that's a matter of domestic affairs, and other countries have no right to look at our domestic affairs. You can look at our international affairs, but not our domestic affairs. CSC crossed a divide with the Helsinki Accords, and that certainly is one of the things that allowed, I think, the rise of things like the Commission and the work that we did on there, as well as, I think, much subsequent international work as well that we're hearing about.
All right. Thank you very much. So I have a list of about 8 questions, and we'll need to be a little bit brief, or else we'll have to cancel the rest of the day's program. But I really like the groundwork that's been laid here, because in a way you've anticipated the next question, which we want to focus on. You'll see that this panel begins with the word protection. And what we're really wanting to focus on is egregious violations of human rights and human dignity, and the type of issues that Simona is working with, genocide and crimes against humanity. You know, we here in the United States sometimes think that, you know, whether you can have a Christmas tree in the mall is the defining character of the war on Christmas, for example. But what we realize that there are really quite a few places around the world where there are severe and significant violations of religious freedom, of identity, of ethnicity. And what we see from even just the representatives on this panel is there's quite an extensive web of both formal and informal approaches to addressing these violations of human rights. What I'd like to ask you is, what works in your view? What, not so much what we should be doing, but something that's happening that you've seen that seems to make a difference with respect to the protection of these important human rights of human dignity and religious freedom. And I don't want to go down the whole row again, but I'm really hoping just to have you indicate a readiness to speak, and let's hear from at least 2 or 3 of you, and then we'll go on to the next question. What works? Please.
Silence.
Yeah.
Thanks, Simona.
Yes, thank you.
I'm glad someone was willing to speak up. If nothing works.
Yeah. So I think this is something that has been already mentioned by my colleague here, Mr. Jan Fiegel, the engagement with religious leaders and actors. This is something that my office really considers as a priority. Engaging religious community, leaders, actors, faith-based organizations in the prevention of atrocity crimes. But in particular, engaging faith leaders and actors in the prevention of incitement to violence that could lead to atrocity crimes. Now, going back to the issue of FORB, of freedom of religion and belief, we really believe in my office that we are living in extremely difficult times where we are seeing an increase of incitement to violence along religious, national, ethnic, and racial lines in the last few years. And this is something that doesn't apply only to a specific region, but globally. We have a global mandate. We don't look only at countries in Africa, in Asia, but we really look at the entire world. And unfortunately, I think this is something that we will all agree with. There has been an increased rise in hate speech that sometimes constitute incitement to violence globally. And for us, this is an indicator of bad things to happen. When people incite to violence, to discrimination, and to hostility, in particular along ethnic, religious, and national lines, this constitutes an indicator and even a trigger of serious violence to happen. So by observing this increase in this phenomenon, we've also observed a relation to a rise in incitement to violence and decrease of freedom of religion and belief. That means that many times incitement to violence is made along religious lines. People are calling for violence to be committed based on religion, calling masses of people to act violently on people that are different because of what they believe in, or maybe what they don't believe in. So that's why Mr. Dieng is my special advisor on the prevention of genocide, who is also a person of faith. He has decided to establish a dialogue with religious leaders and actors and FBOs, faith-based organization, on how they can be engaged more deeply in the prevention of incitement to violence globally. And this has led us to establish a network of religious leaders and actors that really are fully committed to the contribution of incitement to violence and prevention of atrocity crimes. This has led to a major document that has been developed by my office in collaboration with the religious leaders and actors and FBOs, that is called the Plan of Action for Religious Leaders and Actors to Prevent Incitement to Violence that could lead to atrocity crimes. I can tell you more after about this, but this is something that we really believe is having a strong impact on the ground globally on the prevention of incitement to violence and on the protection of human dignity, based also on the protection of freedom of religion and belief. The document is online, it's public. I brought some copies here also. My suitcase was delayed, it's coming in the next few hours. I'll be distributing them among you. It's really something that my office is monitoring impact on in different regions. We have implemented it in Asia. We are conducting meetings in Africa, in Europe, on this continent also, and we really believe that religious leaders and actors can have a major contribution in the prevention of serious violence, and therefore they need to be engaged and involved actively.
Brett, can I add?
Let me just interject one thing, then I'll turn to you, Michael. I think this is a really important point. It seems oftentimes the triggers of violence and the violence doesn't happen automatically. There's usually an interceding step of often religious leaders acting as either accelerants or decelerants of the incitement. And so I think this focusing on the role of religious leaders is exactly right. It really fits exactly with our thinking. And it's one of the reasons why in this forum we want to have religious leaders, government officials, and academics, because we think these groups really need to be talking to each other. Michael?
Just be very quick about it, Brett. If you look over the past 20 years, interestingly, economic sanctions of a variety of different kinds actually have been effective. I mean, I'm not sure we're happy about that, but there's a lot of evidence of that, as has, to be honest about it, military intervention. Again, not things we're particularly happy about, but they do work. The two areas which I think we have real opportunities, haven't exploited very much, are, we talk a lot about disincentives, but what are the incentives to actually develop the kind of behavior that you really like to see in these contexts? There's a lot of work to be done in that regard, I think. And the other area in which, when you see them dip their toes in the water, have an enormous impact, is actually to engage the corporate sector. I mean, when you're thinking about what will shape of many countries their behavior, they're seeking foreign investment. They're trying to create robust economies and economic development. Among the drivers of that is where corporations will site and what behaviors they will demand out of a government where they do site. And you see that on the few occasions in which that really has been done, it's been powerful and effective. So there are tools out there, some of which we would prefer to not use or use only very sparingly, but there's a whole set of tools we haven't really explored that I think there's some real opportunities.
Yeah, I think the point about the corporate sector is really important. We've seen corporations become very influential in a variety of social movements such as gay rights. And there are organizations, I'm thinking of Brian Grimm's Religious Freedom in Business Foundation, that's trying to encourage corporations to do something similar with respect to religious freedom, realizing that corporations are going to be multi-religious entities. And having an entity that is supportive of the religious convictions and identities of the various people in the corporation is going to be good for business, but also really important in a variety of ways. So I really like that suggestion a lot. What else works? Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Thanks, Juliana.
Yeah. I think just to add to what's already been said in terms of tools, existing tools that are out there, and I agree with both points that have been made. I think I would add to that the work of the special UN mandate holders, such as, for instance, in this case, the UN Special Rapporteur for Freedom of Religion or Belief, and other special rapporteurs who really work to increase literacy around specific human rights. So the work that, in this case, Dr. Shahid has been leading on is really to increase greater understanding of what freedom of religion or belief actually really means, and its intersectionality with other rights. And the other tool that we have at our disposal is the power of convening spaces for dialogue. And spaces for dialogue that include conversations with special rapporteurs, whether it's through official visits that they lead in countries that they're focusing on. But for instance, from a Canadian perspective, Dr. Shahid has been able to visit us on unofficial visits on a couple of times, and we've leveraged these visits to ensure that he has an opportunity to speak with the diverse faith and belief communities across Canada. And what this allows is for civil society organizations that are core to the dialogue and that are really important to the work that we do, to have an exchange with the special rapporteur. So in instances where there are countries that he is unable to visit in an official capacity, he's still able to speak to representatives of these faith and belief communities and hear their concerns, even if they're in Canada. And the work that the special rapporteurs are doing amongst themselves is also very important. So, for instance, Canada, along with Denmark and the EU, we've been placing special focus at the International Contact Group for Freedom of Religion or Belief on the intersectionality between women's rights and FORB. And through this work, we've also co-sponsored, most recently in May, a discussion at the Human Rights Council on freedom of religion or belief and women's rights with these special representatives, special UN mandate holders. So there are many of such.
Yeah, that's a great set of comments. The previous special rapporteur for freedom of religion and belief, Heiner Bielefeld, was our keynote speaker here a couple years ago, and we worked closely with him and also with Ahmad Shahid. And I agree with you. I think that's a really powerful mechanism, and them working together is also very powerful. The special rapporteur on expression and religion did a joint report, which I think is really significant and a meaningful way of engagement. I love what you said about the power to convene. I think of the contact group that you're spearheading, and that's a really good example of that power to convene as being something that can work. And I think we can think further about how to utilize that power. And the connection between FORB and women's rights is really interesting, because sometimes religion and women's rights are viewed as being in conflict with each other. But freedom of religion and women's rights is not in conflict. In fact, the social science data really emphasizes that in places where freedom of religion and belief is highly valued, the outcomes, the social and welfare economic outcomes for women are much better. So we also know that women tend to be more religious than men, just on average. Sorry, men, we're a little slow on this. But I think these connections between the very powerful women's rights NGOs and freedom of religion and belief efforts, we're just beginning to figure out how to harness those. And so I think that's a really great observation. Jan, you wanted to jump in here.
Yeah, I will try to respond to your point, what works, and also to connect with my speech here last year. And I said that evil works, and it's, very active day and night, and has very efficient, strong, but cheap allies present everywhere, in strong countries and in poor countries as well. It's indifference, ignorance, and fear, the three allies of evil: indifference, ignorance, and fear. So we need to do something against these allies of evil and something for common good. And this particularly is about engagement or responsibility, education, and courage. To stand up and to say something on behalf of those who cannot stand up, who cannot say anything, because they are in tragic situations. For example, there is a very interesting and timely proposal to have an international day commemorating victims and survivors of religious persecution. Not only Holocaust, this was a nightmare, but there are many. I am here because there was a nightmare of Christians, Yazidis, Shia Muslims, Kakais, Sabaks, Turkmens, killed en masse by ISIS terrorists. Not a long time ago, quite recently. And again and again. So simply we need to do something for awareness raising, all of us, not only some time, commemoration time or anniversaries, day by day, because evil acts day by day. So this is about awareness raising and engagement for good, for common good, for all. Different segments of society, yes. Corporate social responsibility is important. Many companies are stronger than states, real powers. And if they care, we feel it. If they don't, we feel it. Faith. 84% of globe is linked or claim religious affiliation. So religious social responsibility is to be understood. And not only understood, but also pursued. In 1965, the largest global denomination, Catholic Church, adopted very important America-inspired document called Dignitatis Humanae on religious freedom for all. For all. 2012, Al-Azhar, the supreme Sunni authority, adopted a declaration on human dignity. So maybe too late or a bit late, but still adopted. And last year in June, Pope Francis and Grand Mufti of Al-Azhar met together. People don't read too much encyclicals or fatwas, documents. Even people from this room. We need to read more or learn more, but they see pictures, they see meetings, they understand messages, and that's something what should be done more, not only occasionally. To show, for example, a few hours ago, an appeal ended in Islamabad on Asia Bibi, the last appeal. She's probably one of the most famous cases worldwide on blasphemy, capital punishment. We shall see the decision, because Supreme Court took some time for reflection after hearings today. But in many countries of the world, atheism or blasphemy is punished by death. 13 countries in the world. And we speak about humanity and human rights. In 22 countries, conversion is punished by death. To change. And there are many more other problems. So why I say it? Because we can and we should do something more, all of us. I'm glad that in Europe, for example, we have now European Academy of Religion. Because the old continent knows a lot, should learn much more, and help also in the Middle East, in the world around, to live more in peace and in respect of human dignity for all. And the last not least, faith and reason are two major drivers of civilization. If they work against each other, it's a tragedy. If they work in coalition or in pursuit of common good, justice for all, this is a great time for civilization, moving ahead for better times. And I think that's the time now. So there are many ways how to answer, but these three principles to overcome allies of evil by allies of good is our invitation.
You know, those words you shared with us last year have been seared in my mind, because none of us wants to think of ourselves as evil, but we've all experienced ignorance, indifference, and fear. And those truly are the allies of evil, and that's a powerful reminder to each of us that we need to be willing to stand up. I appreciate your invocation of Dignitatis Humanae. I personally believe this is the most powerful document in the world in defense of freedom of religion and belief, largely because it spoke to the largest religious community in the world and made religious freedom a matter of religious importance. And what we see around the world is that countries where the Catholic Church is the largest religious group, religious freedom tends to prevail. And that's not true of countries where virtually every other religious tradition is in a dominant position. So it reminds us that, as you have pointed out, it's going to be religion and its interpretation of its own faith that contributes to religious freedom. It may be that religion is the obstacle to religious freedom that we need to be concerned about. Michael, did you want to add anything on this question, or should I move to the next?
Yeah, I just want to add a little bit of, now that I don't have that, I'm not burdened by experience, then I might be burdened by history, and a little bit lesson on this violation and how to address it and what have worked. I'm not sure that it's possible to make generalization of what works, but at least in our experience of what have worked when it came to prosecution, for example, in Denmark, when it came to the prosecution of the Jews, what really worked and what helped the 97% of the Jews who were saved of the Danish community was a particular cooperation between the Lutheran Church and civil society. I mean, the Danish Jews were transported by fishermen boats to Sweden and were saved by the bell just before having to be sent to concentration camp, and 97% of the 8,000 Jews we had. So I use this as an example to say, well, that particular cooperation between civil society, another religion hidden on the roofs of the Lutheran Church and so forth, was particularly important in understanding perhaps also how can we help spur the cooperation in other countries so that there might be this attempt for other religious leaders to help when minority groups are attacked. Anyway.
Yeah, your comment really echoes what Judge Ann Power Ford said last night about who came for me, who is left when we're not willing to come for each other. I'd like to move on to the next question, and I'd like to preface it with a little story. We're trying to organize a conference in December on human dignity for everyone everywhere in commemoration of the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And I sent an invitation to a very prestigious American law professor, and I got a response from him yesterday declining to participate on the grounds that human dignity is an empty concept, that it is often used in ways that are very conclusory, and he's very skeptical that it has any real meaning. 15 minutes later, we began our plenary session, and Judge Power Ford spoke eloquently and powerfully, in my view, about specific ways and specific cases that human dignity had borne out, whether it was cases of conscientious objection to military service, the treatment of prisoners, the treatment of immigrants seeking asylum. But I think it is fair to say that many people will say that, speaking of the UDHR, for example, these are non-binding and excessively and vague provisions. And my question for this panel is, what value do such vague and non-binding concepts as human dignity and freedom of religion or belief have in the world? Do they have any practical value, even though they may be non-binding? Michael Young, you look like you're ready to share some wisdom.
I was precisely realizing how little wisdom I have in this regard. International declarations are interesting in that there is a tension between specificity and adoption. And if you actually, the more specific you get and you put real teeth behind it, the more narrow the definition. I mean, that just is an international reality. And so in many ways, some of our most aspirational things are really necessarily a little bit vague, and they're necessarily non-binding because you can't get countries to bind to that. I mean, that's just a practical fact, a historical reality. On the one hand, on the other hand, what's really dignity like freedom. I mean, these are vague concepts, but they beg for people to actually fill them with some content. And we've seen that with freedom of religion. I mean, there's a great deal of analysis and thought about what do we really mean by that. And that very dialogue itself also allows us to talk about why it's important. Is dignity a matter of being able to be a conscientious objector? Is freedom of religion, a matter of being able to wear a hijab? I mean, we are giving content that. The very act of talking about it and giving content allows us to begin to define, I think, what the international community really ought to expect of each other.
Yeah, that's such a great metaphor, that idea of begging to be filled. Cole Durham, when we were talking about this in Oxford this summer, talked about human dignity not so much as a shallow concept as an invitation to depth. And we're going to fill that concept perhaps in different ways from different perspectives, but it does start a conversation. I think I may have cut you off though, Michael. What else?
No, I just follow Cole and whatever he says, so this is easy. No, but I think you're absolutely right, and we talk about these concepts, and if we agree dignity is human dignity matters, we agree freedom of a certain sort, freedom of thought, conscious belief, other sorts, freedom of the press, we then start to give, we then have to have a serious conversation. We are obligating ourselves. What we do bind ourselves to do is to talk about it and to try and define it, and in the process of defining it, then and that is, I think, in many ways the commitment we make when we sort of agree, to these soaring declarations, is an obligation to, fill it up with and it evolves. We understand that as well, and that's good too. But to fill it up, and then as we fill it up, begin to then hold each other to that standard.
Yeah, maybe sometimes we think too much about binding others. I like this idea of binding ourselves, that if we claim to care about human dignity for whatever reason, perhaps it's because we believe that we are created in the image of God, that places a burden on us, on me, in the way I think about these things. Jan, what do you say to this question? Oh, it's vague and empty.
Look, I'm in the country which commemorates and quotes a lot Declaration of Independence. Is it important for you, my fellow Americans? Is it? Is it binding? So I think we need something similar in the world. Something what is binding because we believe in, we share, it's my conviction, not because somebody told, be good or obey. And UN Declaration from 1408, now 70 years old, came as a complement to the Charter, because Charter speaks about freedoms and human rights, but that's enough. And something was needed to explain what kind of human rights, what kind of freedoms we want to embrace for different world after Second World Wars, which was a world war, a nightmare, and in a way it still continued in the Cold War. So from declarations we get to implementation after some time, and to be more concrete, in UN terms, it came with the International Convention on civil and political rights in 1966 and 76. Now this convention has 172 ratifications plus 8 signatures, and the wording is the same. Article 18 in the declaration, Article 18 in the convention has the same wording. So we have it. It took some time, but we have it. And here on dignity, I think it's a very ripe time to stop the century of genocides. I'm just repeating myself in a way because I spoke here 2 years ago about century, which started in 1915, 1916. We can go even deeper. And there were many different mass atrocities. And then definition came, what genocide means. Homicide, Polish have word ludobójstwo, killing of people, just because they are people, different people, of course. We have definition from 48, even convention against genocide, but repetitive failures. Why I say? Because human dignity came into international law after Second World War. For some, even professors, it's empty. For some, it's an invitation, it's a base, it's principle. I think it's something what we need to develop fairly from different angles, religious, non-religious. Dignitatis is the word term we use. Muslims use karamah. Jews speak about kabot. But what is important that we understand each other, that dignity is
Thanks, Jan.
for all and of all.
Yeah, I think it is important to point out to those who say this is vague and non-binding, well, we do have the ICCPR, and this is a covenant, a legal commitment that if you have signed it and ratified it, you have agreed to do this. And so it's a little disingenuous for those who represent states to make this argument. I'm interested in Simona's view on this, because you really deal with some of the most egregious violations of human rights and human dignity. How do you respond to this? Oh, it's vague and it's unenforceable. Because if this was specific and enforceable, we wouldn't have any more genocides. So our human rights, the fact that we have these problems and human rights exist, is it evidence that, what does it mean?
Thank you. Just to add to what Mr. Jan Fiegel said, I mean, of course, we know that the UDHR is not binding, but most of the language that is contained in the UDHR is then replicated in conventions that are binding. The ICCPR, as you say, the International Covenant on Social and Economic Rights, and others, including the Genocide Convention. If we go back to human dignity, and as I mentioned also at the beginning of this panel, the first international convention that was signed was the Genocide Convention in 48, one day before the UDHR, and is binding for all those countries that have signed and ratified it. So I wouldn't support the argument of the vagueness of the concept of human dignity just based on the link to the UDHR. So, but also, you know, if you ask me how we can use the concept of human dignity in a practical way, I would also go back to what the colleague, his name, I forgot his name, sorry, the one who was been working on the International Commission on Freedom of Religion and
Michael
Belief. Exactly, Michael made at the beginning of his presentation that the FORB and in general human dignity is not, international human rights standards in general are not in the emptiness. They are connected to human security and development. And that's why they are at the basis of the Sustainable Development Goals. If you go back to the SDGs, in particular SDG 16, building or fostering peaceful, inclusive and fair societies, it's all about implementing international human rights standards, including FORB, for the purpose of providing all human beings, irrespective of their race, nationality, ethnicity, and religion, the basic dignity that they deserve, just because they are human beings. So for me, it goes back to the fact that the conventions are binding, but also to the fact that these conventions are linked to the further discourse on human development that goes back to the implementation of the SDGs.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate your mention of the Sustainable Development Goals, because one thing we've noticed about those is they're unlikely to be implemented, many of them, maybe most of them, without the cooperation and work of faith communities. You think of who delivers education in this world, who delivers health care in this world, who delivers elder care in this world. And if you're going to try to solve these problems without engaging religious communities, the likelihood of your solving or even addressing these issues effectively is not very great. Well, and I hope you'll let me send this law professor your talk from last night, because it was just such a powerful, instantaneous rebuttal of the last email I received before we began our opening session. I may have to send him a little video clip of this panel's answers as well, because it is a real problem, this idea of vagueness, and we still live in a world where human dignity is under assault in so many ways that it would be easy to adopt the stance of a skeptic or even a cynic towards human rights. I want to ask the next question, which sort of builds upon this issue of genuine and egregious violations of human rights. And Simona, I'm going to try to start with you on this one, because just in the last month, there's been an important fact-finding mission that was formed by the UN Human Rights Council to investigate rights abuses against the Rohingya Muslims in Myanmar. And they released a report detailing indiscriminate killings, villages burned to the ground, children and women assaulted. I care about this quite a lot because we've been working intensively in Myanmar over the last 5 years, and it's discouraging work in some ways. But on the other hand, it is very meaningful work because people there are so hungry for information and education and tools for responding. The UN Security Council then, quote, called for immediate steps to end the violence in Rakhine, de-escalate the situation, re-establish law and order, and ensure the protection of civilians. My question for you, Simona, and then opening it to the rest of the panel, is what practical steps can those of us who are not UN officials be taking to help address situations like, let's call it almost an ethnic cleansing, perhaps an ethnic cleansing of the Rohingya Muslims in Myanmar?
This is a $1 million question. Well, you mentioned the report of the international investigations on Myanmar, which is unfortunately not the only report that has been drafted recently about situations of possibly atrocity crimes. We have the situation in Iraq with the extermination of the Yazidi. We have ongoing killings along ethnic and religious lines in CAR. In Sudan, the situation is getting better, but let's see. We are in a standby mode. And other many countries where violence, where extreme levels of violence are ongoing. So when you ask me what the international community can do to contribute to the prevention and addressing these crimes, I would go back to the responsibility to protect principle, according to which states have the primary responsibility to protect their populations from atrocity crimes, by which we mean genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and ethnic cleansing, but they are not the only responsible of course, you know, they have the primary responsibility, but it goes back to the wider community. And the wider community includes us, includes international entities, includes civil society, includes scholars and academics. So I think each of us, in its institutional or individual capacity, has a responsibility to contribute to the prevention of atrocity crimes globally. And the reports on the responsibility to protect that have been drafted by the special advisor on R2P on the responsibility to protect provide a series of recommendations to state and non-state actors to contribute to this effort. So I would ask you to, in this context, to go and check the reports of the special advisors that are online and available. Yeah, so I would refer to definitely to the R2P, to the implementation of the R2P principle.
Well, I think this sense that all of us can do something in our lane is really an important point, and that the duty to protect applies not just to states, and we can encourage our states, but also to us in our other capacities. I think of The Power of the Pen and Evelina, for example, who writes very powerfully in defense of groups that are suffering a significant persecution in periodicals of wide circulation. And I think each of us perhaps can think concretely about what we can add. I have Michael Schur and then Michael Young, so let's get comments from each of you.
Just to add what was already said, 2 weeks ago there was a decision at the General Assembly on creating a mechanism to document the atrocity, what has happened to the Rohingyas in Myanmar, and that decision was interesting and very, hopefully also very useful in the future case holding, but also hopefully for the prevention in the future. It has two interesting aspects. One, first of all, it was a cooperation between the OIC and the Western countries, and secondly, it was because it was a decision by the General Assembly, the financing of this mechanism is done through the UN budget, not on a voluntary basis as we saw in Syria. So it gives some sustainability to the process, and the endeavor will actually be carried out. Just to have a note on that, and also linking up to some of the other questions which have earlier been raised on the principal university.
Yeah, the importance of documentation cannot be overstated. Michael?
Brett, this really relates in an important way to your earlier question about binding. We keep talking about binding, but then there's also a question of enforcement. And this highlights one of the real challenges we face, which is with all the talk we can do to all the organizations, absent state will, it doesn't happen. And this is a perfect example. The Genocide Convention, to which many, many countries are signatories, actually requires countries who are signatories to take action in the event of genocide. Well, what's the consequence of that? The consequence of that is we talk about ethnic cleansing, we talk about killing people, we don't use the word genocide, because it obligates countries to do something in particular. And so far you can count on a number, I don't think I have enough fingers and toes to count the number of genocides since countries have signed the Genocide Convention. And I think with the exception of the bombing of Bosnia, it's hard to imagine and identify countries that have actually intervened in accordance with an obligation to which they have actually assigned. And I'm acutely aware of this. I was in the State Department during the first Bush administration, and there was a lot of question as to whether Cambodia was genocide. It was clearly genocide, And I finally forced my part of the State Department, which got to testify about it, to call it genocide. First time we'd ever called anything that happened genocide. Now, what permitted me to do it? Well, in part, it was completely in the past. There was nothing left to be done. But the use of that word genocide, we felt, triggered an obligation on the part of the United States. And the result was the will to actually do something wasn't there, and therefore the use of the word and invoking that obligation. And we see that all the time.
Yeah, boy, calling something by its name seems pretty simple, but it's fraught, isn't it? Yeah, thanks.
I think, in addition to everything that's been said, I think I also wanted to add the importance of not only the coordination that happens within the UN proper itself in terms of countries that are around the table at the UN, but the importance of coordination of our missions in these specific countries where atrocities are being committed, and in this case in Myanmar. The importance of their work, of their coordination, of their exchanges. They're on the ground, they're seeing what's happening, they are speaking to the civil society organizations that are trying to record and register issues of atrocity. So I just wanted to point to the importance of that conversation happening and informing what's happening at the UN and informing countries who are taking their decisions to act.
Thank you. Let me shift to another question. This is a difficult one in a way. It has to do with what we see happening in many places in the world as resurgent nationalism. And often these nationalisms seem closely identified with majority religious groups. I'm thinking here of Russian Orthodoxy in Russia. I'm thinking of Hindu nationalism in India. I'm even thinking of Buddhist nationalism in Myanmar. We see a variety of types of Islamic nationalism rising even in secular countries such as Turkey. And with these nationalisms comes a pretty direct assault on the idea of universality, and in particular, universal human rights. And so what I'd like to ask you to address is, what do you see as the connection between religion, nationalism, and human rights, and is there much to be done? Let me set the stage with a quote from Robert Kagan, an American historian and columnist who's advised both Republican and Democratic presidential candidates. In a new book, he addresses the issue of nationalism in pretty stark terms. This is what he said: "We do not face a choice between good and bad, but between bad and worse. It is between maintaining the liberal world order with all the moral and material costs that entails, or letting it collapse and courting the catastrophes that must inevitably follow." Is that a overstatement, an alarmist articulation, or how do you react to Robert Kagan's pronouncement, and more generally, religion, nationalism, human rights? What's going on in the nexus of those things? Michael Young, could you get us started?
Well, no.
Well, why did you look so ready to speak to me?
Because I'm gonna reframe it just slightly.
Okay, thank you.
I think we're in a very interesting position globally. We're in a position of economic prosperity that's unprecedented in world history. Not every single country has risen to the level of Denmark and other countries, but all rising significantly, except where there's complete war and total breakdown. But everywhere else is rising. But we're also seeing a concomitant rise of nationalism of a pretty significant sort. There's significant research beginning to emerge suggesting that economic disparity and nationalism have a very deep connection. And we see that historically, and we see that in current behavior, current political developments. I raise that because I think, in many ways, we've seen it in spectacular terms here in the United States. That seems to me an issue that has a profound religious dimension to it. And if religions, if we're looking for anywhere to address nationalism, I mean, this comes at it through a back door, but it seems to me the notion of the less fortunate, the notion of if we reduce those economic disparities, and religion seems to me has the most powerful ideological and moral foundation for describing how a society ought to organize itself to do that. I think we see a very different dynamic, but we see nationalism rise in almost a linear relationship to economic disparity.
Thank you. That's a really important, not just correlation, but I think causal reality that may be driving some of these nationalisms. Anyone else want to chime in on the question of religion, nationalism, and human rights? Thank you, Jan.
Yeah, this is not easy topic, but very important for all of us, because those who do not understand religion, and especially instrumentalization or abuse, better to say abuse of religion, cannot understand what is going on in the world. And once we don't understand, we cannot help, or we can even damage the problem by making it bigger. Secondly, those who do not understand identity cannot understand why populism, even extremism and nationalism, of course, is so much on rise. Because identity is important for everyone. I am different from my son. That's principle. We are all different. Nobody's identical to anybody in the history and for future, unless we clone human beings. I hope no. So identity is important, and we cannot underestimate it or undermine it, but rather work for the positive side of identity, because it's principle, it's originality of everyone, and communities as well, and nations as well. And one world invites us for one unity, for something as a human family with really dignity of everyone everywhere, universal principles, universal rights. I believe that there are such universal rights, and the list is famous, and 70 years show that we have a lot of homeworks in our countries to deal with understanding of universal human rights. Solution is neither collectivism. I lived half of my life in collectivist or Stalinist Czechoslovakia, where limited sovereignty was the principle. And 50 years ago, Soviet and Warsaw Pact troops came to limit sovereignty of Czechoslovakia because it was for the interest of a bloc. So we have been limited for 22 years by occupation. But the other extreme is individualism without any linkage to communities or to personalism. And individualism without mature sense of sovereignty leads also to the problem. So what we need is mature sovereignty, responsible freedom, to pursue justice for all, common good, bonum commune. The European Union is fruit of common good. Good for France, good for Germany, good for Slovakia, even for those who are coming. Even for those who decide to leave, we are free community. And dignity of all. So why I mentioned, because resignation on human rights is resignation on justice. It's resignation on peace, because peace is fruit of justice. And any superioritism, meaning I am more than, my nation is more than, my country is more than, my religion is more than, leads to a problem or conflict or tragedy. There are many lessons I don't need to repeat. I'm still not so old, but on the other side, yes, there were many tragedies in our countries based on superioritism. So my conclusion is common good, principle which is important for politics, for law, for academia, for education, for upbringing of our children.
Thank you. I'd like to end on a positive note if we can. we'd like to invite you to share with us any examples of particular instances, people, situations you're aware of where someone really stood up for the human dignity of others in a way that made an impression on you. I'll share an experience I had about a year ago in Myanmar, where we were teaching a program on religion and the rule of law in Mandalay. And one of the students in this program was a little Buddhist monk. I say little because he was about 5 feet tall, but he was a giant. In his little village, there had been a conflict that broke out between Buddhists and Muslims. It was based upon a dispute with a shopkeeper that was Muslim, that resulted in some Buddhist hooligans burning down the shop, which resulted in some Muslim hooligans killing a Buddhist that was uninvolved, which resulted in open season on Muslims in this Buddhist majority village. And this monk had a monastery, and there were about 700 Muslims, Rohingya Muslims, who fled to this monastery seeking protection during the dark night of this violence. And about 700 people took refuge in this monastery, and he actually stood at the door of the monastery through the night when the proverbial mob with pitchforks and burning torches came demanding access. And he said, "You'll have to come through me. You'll have to kill me if you want to get in and kill these people." And he was there as our student, and yet it was so humbling to think of the way he had literally stood with his body between the mob and innocent people who were different, who were a different ethnic group, a different religious group, and yet he was willing to put his life and body on the line to protect them. That made me realize that my commitment to these issues is rather easy in comparison to the challenges that he faced. Do any of you have, they don't have to be dramatic or involve something like that, but are there people who've made an impression on you for what they've done as individuals to protect the human dignity of others? Simona, do I see you nodding your head?
Yeah. Yes, why not? I mean, I think that the stories are many. There are many stories that we don't know than the stories that we do know. And I think this is unfortunate because these are the kind of good news that we need to share more. But I mean, from the history of the Holocaust to the genocide in Rwanda, where Muslims saved many lives, but also to more contemporary times, I can just mention something that is very close to my heart, because it's a situation that it's somebody who is that he's in my country. I'm from Italy, and the mayor of a small town in the south, in Riace, has been, during the last years, has been protecting legal immigrants to the point that last week he was arrested. But in the current government, what he has been doing has been criminalized, and he has been arrested. And last weekend there was a demonstration. 5,000 people went to Riace and demonstrated, walked to his house to show solidarity. So there are many of these cases in the past, in the present. As I say, we are going through very complicated times. You mentioned the issue of the connection of religion, populism, and ethno-nationalism. And this is something that is very close to my office. we are organizing a conference, just for you to know, on this specific topic and how religious leaders and actors can be co-opted, in particular in populist and ethno-nationalist, actually ultra-nationalist contexts, for the protection of religious minorities, refugees and migrants. I think, it's something very concerning, and there are a lot of cases of people who are standing up in this kind of contents to protect people in the street, in the schools, in the community, because there is a very high, a very big wave of intolerance that is really changing many of the dynamics of solidarity that we were used to in the past.
Thank you, Simona. I love that comment. There are more stories that we don't know than that we know.
Yeah.
And I think that I used to believe in the power of argument. I was a philosopher and have 2 degrees in philosophy. And these days I believe in the power of a story more than the power of an argument. Michael Young.
One of my extraordinary heroes in this area, which always gives hope to me as a lawyer, because there's so many reasons not to have hope as a lawyer, is Tom Bergenthal. Tom, one of the youngest survivors of Auschwitz, and wears the number on his arm with some pride. Ended up in the United States, went to NYU Law School, then went to Harvard, got a JSD working with Louis Sohn, who Louis, of course, was one of the drafters of the UN human rights documents. And together, Louis and Tom, both of them were very, very close friends, largely developed a sort of field of international human rights law. And this is a man who had probably more reason to be bitter and angry about life and the world and everything, but instead channel that into trying to help us all think through what a regime that would actually protect human dignity would look like. And eventually ended up, of course, as a justice on the International Court of Justice. He served on many of the human rights commissions in South America. But the example of moving from Auschwitz and that experience to his passion for understanding that we might, by looking at our better angels, create a regime in which we really would be able to and obligated and able to define what protection for each other looks like, to me is one of the extraordinary stories.
Thank you. I think we'll end on that powerful note. I think, Michael, you were his dean when you were dean of George Washington Law School, so you got to know him well and understand that story in a very powerful way. Well, I have a few announcements, but before I make them, let me ask you to join me in thanking our extraordinary panel for sharing so candidly their views and expertise. All right, you'll be happy to note I'm letting you out 1 minute early.